Okay, so it's with great pleasure that I'm introducing Shalom Aptekar. He actually sent us an email asking if he could present, and we always love that because we need more presenters. If you do anything, even if it's like a complete and absolute train wreck, people like to hear about that as well because that's a learning experience. If you know, just the discovery process, like a lot of people don't want to speak at the meetups because they're worried they don't know enough, but that's actually very interesting for a lot of people as well. It's sort of like a case study in adopting a new technology. So if you guys are doing any kind of PhoneGap or HTML5 work and you're interested in speaking, please send an email to the organizers of the meetup, and we'd love to have you speak. So with that, I'll hand it off to you.
Sure. Awesome. Hi. So I'm going to be like mostly discussing about it's going to be like partially design, partially dev, like and a lot of planning. And I'll try to cover like stuff that'll be kind of useful to people who are working on their own applications or also on a team. All right, so a little about me. I used to do a lot of drawing and a lot of painting, and then I became a designer, and then I tried doing development. And I started playing with PhoneGap like about 6 months ago. And I've mostly been doing it for Windows Phone. It's a really good environment to start off with. And I know a lot of people are probably doing like Genymotion, and we'll probably like touch on that a little bit. So I'll be kind of going through the app process of actually making it, planning it, designing it, doing the assets, and then doing the publishing and so forth. So kind of don't panic. When you're kind of dealing with the designer and planning your application, you generally want to like keep a consistent like set of rules when you're designing something because you want to continuously reuse elements through your web application. So I like to keep things generally spaced out in like multiples of 2, multiples of 3, that sort of material. And it's good that you meet with a designer early in the process of planning something so that you don't run into the problem later on where you have so much unique CSS that your app becomes like really overburdened and like inconsistent. It leads to very slow speeds when you're doing transfers, and it also leads to an inconsistent user experience, like when you're actually going through it. I recently came across, so when you're prototyping your application, a lot of companies will use something like Axure to do your step-by-step design process. But if you want, there's a really nice tool called Envision, which will allow you to collaborate better with your teammates or coworkers about design choices, work, user flow through your application, and general layout. So I'll just go through that really quickly right now. So this is basically a sample mobile web application that you would set up in Envision. And what you can do is go through it. It'll give you different options. You can set like action points where it clicks, and you can get like a good idea of how it should function. And you can also like set comments and that sort of thing. And like as you're going through the process of like planning your application with the designer, it's always like important to keep the idea of like object-oriented CSS in mind when you're creating the styles for the application. Generally, the rule is like be less unique, be more generic, define what your elements and basically your kind of constructors would be. So I like to think of it if you're defining like a class in JavaScript and you would name it like with a capital letter in the first value, you define like possibly like a post or a button, and that would be that type of element in your application. So the simple like example would be the button example, where you would kind of define what a button would be, and then extend from it like the blue, the large, the small, and that so forth. Generally keep with the same idea of like making it reusable, making it like extensible. In a similar concept, like you can also like define like what a post should be like, what a page should look like. The page would have like main class like for the entire like element. So like in this instance, that'd be like post with a capital P would be your object that you'd be defining. and then underneath that object, you'd be defining the post key elements. So you could do an all selector for post dash, and then post photo, post content. That sort of material would be your child elements for that. That way you can keep a consistent, like, readable class list on your DOM. That would be like easy to follow for someone who came after you. The responsive assets. So how you define like your icons and other material, like, it's really important when it comes to the end. And this is kind of why you should, like, if a designer in your workplace doesn't use Photoshop right now, and doesn't do vector based graphics, like, it can be a big minus for you and cause you like a lot more work in the end. What you kind of want to do is, like, even if they are using Photoshop, you should tell them to make vector graphics, because when you do export for your different device densities, it'll make it a lot easier to do that. So if you are going with the PNG route, there'd be a few reasons why you would want to do this. Currently, Android and iOS and Windows Phone, they will all support PNGs. You can define through your media queries what density types you want to target with your like different sprite sheets. So the general idea is to make a type of class for your icon, which would have a background of that particular sprite sheet. So you could break it up by like navigation, user icons, that sort of material, and then define through your sprite sheet if it's a device pixel ratio 2 or 1.5, which one to choose from that. If you're going with the SVG route, this is more for, sorry about that. If you're going with the SVG route, this is more for mobile web applications, not really mobile phone applications. So if you were building a Cordova application, you wouldn't probably use an SVG sprite map. This is because it's not supported in Android, Windows Phone, or iOS right now, like possibly in the future. But for mobile web applications, it makes your life a lot easier, because what you can do, you don't need to worry about creating multiple sprite maps. You can use the same one and just define it based on how big your container should be. So like, this would be a less function, which would basically create the correct size for your container based on, or that would scale to different pixel densities. So you give it the rows, columns, and the icon heights, and then when you use it, you just it will give you the background position in percentages for that particular device, or for that particular size. One thing that might be improved here would be that you could use like REMs that would be based on a base font size for your application or the user's device, and then when you use this sprite map on the element, it would be the consistent size with a properly scaled background. And icon fonts. So a lot of people use Icon Moon for creating icon fonts. The alternative is a really nice website called Fantastic, which I'll go into in a bit. The main benefits of using an icon font compared to PNG or SVG is that it works both on mobile web applications and mobile phone applications. So if you're doing a Cordova application, it would be very useful and would work throughout. How you would kind of define your icons would be through setting a Unicode character that would be associated with that icon, created through Fantastic, Icon Moon, or Inkscape for that instance. And you just declare it, possibly using like a data tag. So I can just show you Fantastic really quickly. So Fantastic, it's sort of like Icon Moon, but it's kind of like better laid out, I feel. You can select with previously created icon fonts and also put your own in from SVGs that you export. You can then customize which Unicode character that you're associating with your icon, and then download it. And it has all the instructions how to use it. So a lot of current users are fiddling around with Grunt. Yeah, so a lot of you might be using Grunt for your workflow right now. And if you do a lot of Node.js work, I would suggest like possibly moving to Gulp to simplify your workflow and make use of make use of streams that are present in Node. I can show you generally what a short example of a Gulp version, a Gulp comparison to a Grunt file that would basically build and compact your CSS on the fly. So you can, just like with Grunt, you can define tasks and require plugins that would compile tasks, do concatenation, do amplification, and then write these tasks that make use of those plugins. You can also set watchers for when you do changes to certain directories, and it will compile it to the distribution directory as well. Okay, so I just want to talk about a little bit about touch events and some of the issues that you might face when you're doing touch events through an AngularJS application for like possibly Windows Phone or another device. What I face is that generally ng Touch was a good first off when you're working with like mobile web apps, but when you're doing like actual mobile application, ng Touch can kind of fall short and doesn't always pick up the action that you're doing. So if you do swipe left, swipe right, it might not always pick it up and transmit it through your application. The workaround for this would be to try using Angular gestures, which is a very nice library that combines Hammer.js with ng Angular directives that give you like multi-touch and also tap and those kind of gestures built in already. ng Touch does offer you to create your own single point gestures, single point touch actions, but it's kind of falls short compared to this library. If you want to check it out more, the links will be in the slides. There's also a really nice tool, Gesture Kit, which is coming out soon. It'll provide a SDK to make your own gestures that can work with your mobile application, even if you're doing like Java, Objective-C, or Cordova. It's currently right now out, but it will also have a licensing fee, I believe. And also for your general mobile web application development, if you're relying on third-party applications, it's always a good idea to make use of deferred async on your script tags. It basically cut down on the time that your JavaScript is held up, even if you are loading at the bottom of the page. You generally want to make sure like the page is fully loaded and communicate that to the user instead of waiting for continuously showing the loading bar because your like ads or Google Analytics is loading up in the background. Also did a few experiments using CSS acceleration in your animations. So it's a common technique to do Translate 3D on your animations to make them like more smooth as they go through. But there are some caveats. I did a few in the experiments. I can show you what they came out to. So my two experiments were it's a giant neon cat. So in one case, I'm using position relative and top in my animation to move the tail, move the cat in like a certain direction. The other experiment is using Translate 3D. So this element is about 10,000 elements long. I tried it with like 1,000 and 10,000, and I also made an analog, which is a list which has computed values on it. One with Translate 3D and one with position. So what I kind of discovered in the end is that the Translate 3D worked a lot better. It was a lot more useful to you when you did computed elements. So like if you had a box with border radius and box shadow and maybe would have like an opacity added to it, Translate 3D works a lot better for you. If you're doing like something that's an opaque image, like the neon cat, the opacity, where there is no opacity, it functions in a less valuable way to you. So it might not be always useful to trade off that compatibility with having a fast animation. And these are kind of like a very large scale, so like 1,000 elements or 10,000 elements is like a very extreme case of this. But what I've found in Cordova is that if you want that smooth animation in your application, and especially if you're doing navigation, with these kind of elements, the ones that have box shadows and like opacities, you generally want to use Translate 3D. It could be useful to you. But at the same time, try it on a turn-by-turn basis, remembering that like opacity computed values are very important in this equation. And just like a small note, like for some applications, like especially on the web, you can, or mobile web applications using Cordova, you should experiment with going through the Flexbox route or using calcs and focusing on newer technologies as well, because you don't need to be limited to using like floats and those sort of ugly elements for your structure and layout. You can be like more experimental with it. I'm going to just like briefly go over like the dev environment for Windows Phone 8. So I built a few Windows Phone 8 applications, and it's generally a very nice environment to work in. There are like a few issues that were kind of bothering, and I can just give you a few hints on how to solve that. So the first issue was, and you might have this issue with other Cordova applications, but the WebKit frame that the application is based in will continuously move as you scroll, won't catch like mouse events. You can kind of remedy this action by setting overflow style to none, as well as getting rid of the bounce scrolling on the application. And you can find, you can look at this afterwards as well. And also, just on other parts of workflow, a lot of you might be using XAMPP Apache to do your web building. Another like awesome solution is this tool. It's WebMatrix. So WebMatrix basically takes the folder that you're currently, your project's currently in and runs an IIS server. So you don't necessarily need to have your project in like htdocs to make it function. You can publish it on, it gives you the option to like run it on different browsers, try it out of the bat, go through browser stack to do your testing, and has a few, like little fun tools like the iPad, iPhone emulator to kind of go about it. It's a really cool option next to WebStorm, and you can do a lot of what WebStorm does. It gives you access to fun extensions that, like the NPM gallery, and that make your life a lot easier in like finding the package that you need at that specific time. And that's about it.